Hello and welcome back. My name is Nathan House and I'm with the Church of Christ in Houston, California. And if you could like or subscribe to this video, that would be appreciated. We're going to be looking for the next few weeks, and I don't know how many of these lessons we'll do, but I want to be looking from the Gospel of Luke and looking around a dinner table. It's interesting to note how many things happen around a dinner table in the book of Luke. Sometimes they are teaching moments. Sometimes so there's maybe a parable referring to a table. Maybe there's an actual literal meal that's occurring, but there's a lot of things that happen around a dinner table in the Gospel of Luke. So the next few weeks, we're going to be looking at some of these and trying to make some observations and some applications from these. We're going to begin, first of all, by just noting that in the Old Testament, there was an expectation that when the Messiah came, there would be a great meal. There was, so you can look it up, and sometimes in some dictionaries, we'll talk about messianic banquets or the messianic meals. So this expectation that when the Messiah came, there was going to be these huge meals, celebrations, and these types of things. And again, that image is actually picked up and carried over into the New Testament, and we see pieces of that in our scriptures that we still study today. This is from Isaiah chapter 25. And again, notice this Old Testament quote, "On this mountain," so he's talking about there in the city of Jerusalem, "on this mountain the Lord of hosts will make for all people a feast of rich food, a feast of well-aged wine, of rich food full of marrow, of aged wine well refined." So a couple of things that are kind of interesting as I just look at this text. It references a meal for all people. And then he talks about, again, that this is going to be made of rich food, well-aged wine. So again, there is this expectation of something. And you could even look at Psalm 23, and you can even kind of see this expectation, as David, of course, is talking about the good shepherd, but he also mentions in verse 5 something kind of interesting. He says, "You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies." So there's just this Old Testament imagery of meals and banquets. And again, this imagery is carried over into the New Testament. One of the passages we're going to look at today is from Luke chapter 5, verse 27. So this is going to be where the apostle Levi is called to his apostleship, also known as Matthew. So you can look at Matthew chapter 9, Matthew chapter 10, Mark chapter 2. And in Mark chapter 2, I believe it's verse 14, you'll see the same call of Levi. But Levi was from the city of Capernaum. We'll see that made clear if you study Mark chapter 2, which we're not going to look at. But the city of Capernaum, again, around the Sea of Galilee, this is where Jesus made the majority of his ministry. So many of the things that we associate with his ministry happened on the Sea of Galilee, around these cities, around this sea, in these cities. Many of his followers came from this area. Again, my wife and I got to visit Israel last year, and we got to go to the Sea of Galilee. We got to go to Magdala, where Mary Magdalene was from. So Jesus' ministry, most of it occurs right around here in the city of Capernaum. This is where Peter lived, and this is where Jesus calls, and you can even notice here, it says up here, you have this, it says Jesus calls Levi, so Matthew, the tax collector, also known as Levi. Jesus calls Levi Simon, also known as Peter. So Jesus calls Levi, Simon, Andrew, James, and John, all from Capernaum. So you have, the Jordan River flowing in the Sea of Galilee. You have some very significant, archaeologically speaking, you can go to Capernaum still today, and you can still go into the synagogue that is still standing there. And most of that synagogue probably is not from the time of Christ, but there was a foundation below this one. And I don't think I have its picture. I guess I do. So you can see this darker part of that synagogue foundation, which they do believe is from the time of Christ. But you can go into the synagogue, and again, Jesus taught in the synagogue at Capernaum. It was interesting because literally right outside the synagogue of Capernaum, I mean 50 yards away from it, is a house that they believe belonged to the apostle Peter. And so they believe that, so this is that structure. They don't know that, of course, it's speculation, of course, but you could go to the city of Capernaum. You could go to where Peter and Andrew and James and John and the apostle Levi were all from. You can walk these streets today. And the thing is kind of interesting to note is these aren't manufactured places. These are real places. Jesus Christ was a real person walking in real cities. And we can still go and visit those places. Anyways, let's get into our text for the day. So what we're looking at is things around a dinner table. in the Gospel of Luke. And it says, after this, he went out and saw a tax collector named Levi sitting at the tax booth. And he said to him, follow me. And leaving everything, he arose and followed him. And Levi made a great feast in his house. And there was a large company of tax collectors and others reclining at table with them. How interesting is this? We see this phrase, reclining at table. It's a pretty common expression in the New Testament pages in the gospel. There was a large company of tax collectors and others reclining at the table with them. So again, we need to remember that the Jews hated tax collectors. First of all, you were working for the Roman government, which everybody hated the Roman government. So you were a Jew who's now working for the enemy. So you were hated. They were despised. And so Levi, he made his living as a tax collector. He throws this great banquet after he's called to follow Jesus Christ. And at this large banquet, he invites, who does he invite? Well, those who he knows. Other tax collectors. And it says, and others were reclining with him. And the Pharisees and their scribes grumbled at his disciples, saying, why do you eat and drink with tax collectors and sinners? Look at the question. Why do you eat and drink with tax collectors and sinners? Jesus answered them, those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance. So Jesus says, if those who are sick don't need a physician, these are sinners. They need a physician. And again, I would think that in verse 32, Jesus is being a little bit sarcastic here. I have not come to call those righteous, but sinners. I think the idea is Jesus doesn't call those who think they're self-made. They're righteous on their own. He didn't come to call them. He came to call those who needed him. And by the way, who needs Jesus Christ? Everybody does. But there were some who trust, and again, Jesus even says, Luke will tell us, Jesus tells a parable later on in the Gospel of Luke. He tells a parable because there were some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous. So I think that kind of fits what we see here. But we have this dinner table scene. And what do we see? And again, I think it's important as we look through these dinner table scenes, look at who's there, who's at the dinner, who's hosting the dinner. Is the dinner crashed? Who crashes the dinner party? What happens at this dinner party? So here we have Levi the tax collector hosting. Who's there? Other tax collectors and sinners. And so what happens there? We have a teaching moment. So around this dinner table in this scene in Luke chapter 5, we have a teaching moment where Jesus speaks to the nature of his ministry and what he has come to do. What a great thing he has come to do. What a wonderful thing that he has come to call. He has come to be a physician to those who need a physician. We are in a world where so many need healing. So many need this love. And something else we're going to note as we go through this book and look at these dinner table scenes is around this dinner table, Jesus is associating with outcasts. Others didn't want to be around tax collectors, but Jesus did. Others didn't want to be around sinners, but Jesus wanted to be their physician. And so Jesus was about others. He was about outcasts. And so it serves as a reminder for us that we need to be looking out for outcasts. There's people all around us that we don't want to meet eye with, right? Because they're homeless. We don't want to talk to them because, well, they're unwanted. There were no unwanted in the ministry of Christ. There were no outcasts. Let's go to another one. Go down to later on to chapter 7, and we see another dinner table scene. So the last dinner table, again, who throws the dinner table? Who's there? I think these are important questions to ask. So who's going to throw this dinner party? This is going to be at the house of a Pharisee. So a religious leader throws this party. One of the Pharisees asked him to eat with him, and he went into the Pharisee's house. And again, notice this expression, he reclined at table. And behold, a woman of the city. Now, this is Luke's comment. So Luke, the writer of this book, this is what Luke says. This is his comment in verse 37. Luke says, and behold, a woman of the city who was a sinner. Luke says a woman crashes the party. She was uninvited. She comes to the house of the Pharisee's house, and she crashes the party. Everybody there at the dinner table knew who she was. That'll become clear as you read the rest of this. Everybody knew who she was. Everybody knew she was a sinner. What kind of courage does it take to come and crash this party at the house of this religious elite man's house? and you're an outcast. Again, just like the tax collectors and sinners of Matthew 5, they were outcasts. She's an outcast. She's unwanted. Those who should have wanted her, those who were the religious leaders who should have cared for outcasts, they didn't want her there. And it says she was a sinner. And it says she brings this alabaster flask of ointment, and standing behind Jesus at his feet, weeping, she began to wet his feet with her tears and wiped them with the hair of her head and kissed his feet and anointed them with ointment. Look at this next statement in verse 39. Look at what the Pharisee said. Now the Pharisee who had invited him saw this. He said to himself, if this man were a prophet, he would have known who and what sort of woman this is who is touching him. Look at what the Pharisee says of her, for she is a sinner. You see, she's a sinner. This man cannot be a prophet. Why? Because he is dealing with sinners. He cannot be a prophet because he is dealing with outcasts. Isn't it crazy how reversed this religious leader has this? If he was a prophet of God, he would have nothing to do with those in need. I think sometimes that trickles down into our own mentality. If we're righteous Christians, we're not going to have anything to do with those in need. You know, and again, I'm not advocating that we should go to bars to try to hang out in bar scenes and things like this. But it is very important to remember that our ministry, our work has to be about outcasts. Everybody is a sinner. Everybody stands in need of Christ. It doesn't matter if it's a person who looks the part, who comes in and he's wearing a suit and he has his wife and children with him and he looks great. He looks the part. Or a person who comes in carrying a backpack and has tattoos and earrings. You see, Jesus Christ came to be a prophet for sinners. He came to be a physician for sinners. And Jesus answered, said to him, Simon, I have something to say to you. And he said, say it. So Jesus tells a parable about a person who was forgiven a lot versus a person who was forgiven a little. And he asks the question, who's going to love more? And then Simon answered, the one, I suppose, for whom he canceled the larger debt. Jesus says, you have judged rightly. Then he says, do you see this woman? I entered your house, Simon. You didn't wash my feet. You see, that was kind of the host's job, to wash the feet of the travelers. This Simon didn't wash the feet of Jesus. Maybe he was too pride-filled. Maybe he didn't care about Jesus. He didn't greet Jesus with a kiss. But look at the contrast Jesus makes between Simon, this religious elite leader, and this sinful woman. He says, I entered your house. You gave me no water. She has wet my feet with her tears. She's wiped them with her hair. You didn't give me a kiss. She has not stopped kissing my feet. You didn't anoint my head, but she's anointed my feet. Therefore, Jesus says, I tell you, her sins. Look at what Jesus says of her sins. Luke calls her a sinner. The man said she was a sinner. Look at what Jesus says. Her sins, which are many, they're forgiven. Well, why? Because she loved so much. Then he says to her, your sins are forgiven. And then they ask a question, which is repeated in the Gospels, at least another time where Jesus heals a paralytic. They ask the question, who is this who even forgives sins? And what's the answer to that? The answer is that it is a prophet of God, not just a prophet of God, the Messiah of God, the anointed of God, the one who the Jewish world was looking forward to. It was God himself in the form of man, in the form of humanity. He came, he forgave sins, he welcomed the outcasts. And it's so interesting, again, to look around these dinner tables and see who's there, what's happening. Well, here again was interesting to look who threw it, who crashed the party. What happens here? Why are you allowing this woman to touch you? And it's interesting, around these dinner tables, there's some who are welcomed and some who are unwelcomed. Around these dinner tables in the Gospel of Luke, there are some divisions that occur. Some who don't see a need for Jesus Christ and some who do. We're going to be looking at some other dinner table scenes in the next couple of weeks. But let's remember this lesson from today. Jesus' ministry was about outcasts, whether it was a tax collector that everybody hated or a sinful woman from the community. Jesus cared about others. His ministry was about others. And let's make sure that we don't box ourselves into our ministry. And let's include in our ministry and in our life those who are outcasts, those who are in need of a physician. You have a great day. God bless.